Hi, Year 11s. Welcome back to AQA Paper 1, November 2018. And what we're going to look at today is some creative writing. So that's question 5, as I'm sure you well know by now. So I've just laid out some learning questions for today's lesson. I think actually there's probably more things that you're going to be learning about than just these, but let's see if we can clarify this. So first off, can you generate ideas for creative writing? So we're going to be thinking about a question and about how you're going to put your ideas together. Secondly, can you write clearly? Can you create a clear piece of creative writing, specifically looking at choosing clear and effective vocabulary? That's the focus. That's one of the focuses for today. And the second main focus for today is a little bugbear of mine, and that is ing sentence starters. So we're thinking about, can you use ing sentence starters accurately, and then be able to go through and check your work and spot where you've made errors, where you've tried to use ing phrases and clauses. And if you're not quite sure what I mean about that at the moment, I'll talk more about it when I've got some examples to show you. So first off, let's have a look at what the creative writing looked like in November 2018. I personally think it was a really, really smashing question. I really liked it a lot. But let's break it down a bit and just make sure that we're reading the blurb. So question 5, and remember the blurb on top of that says you're in section B of your paper. You should have about 45 minutes to do your creative writing after you've done all of the reading section before. Bear in mind that you might want to start with the creative writing, and that's absolutely fine, but make sure you are dead strict on yourself, because you don't want to stitch yourself up for the reading section. Okay, but if you like your creative writing, if you know that sometimes you don't leave yourself enough time, then this is a really good one to start off with, but make sure you stick to the 45 minutes. Okay, so as always, they give you a little preamble just to remind you like who your audience is. Audience isn't so important in this one as it is on paper 2 with the argumentative writing, but it is important. And here it says your local newspaper is running a creative writing competition and the best entries will be published. So something to be published in your local newspaper, and that means it needs to be suitable for everyone who might read the local newspaper, and that literally does mean everybody. So that means that you're not going to be writing like a serious kind of something about like drug taking or about self-harm or about any of those kind of issues. You're not going to be using strong swear words, because if you do any of those things, then you really haven't nailed your audience. And they'll always make the audience something safe and something generic. So those topics I've mentioned before, like suicide and self-harm, alcoholism, like child abuse, drug taking, anything like that is absolutely, don't do it. Just don't do it. Your school gets a very awkward phone call, like from child protection, if that happens, because we as examiners, we have to escalate that upwards. And as I said, not only don't do it because of that, but also don't do it because it's not hitting your target audience, which could be like the local granny, or it could be an 11-year-old who likes reading the local newspaper. It's that whole spectrum. So it's creative writing anyway. And you've got a choice here. So either write a story about time travel, as suggested by this picture. So your first choice is a story. You've got a really, really good picture here. I'm not really sure about this, but I think someone said to me that it is like a genuine picture of Grand Central Station, just caught at a certain angle at a certain day with genuine light falling through. And you can tell from the way that everyone's dressed that it was probably in the 50s or 60s or something. But it does look really, really space age, doesn't it? So I think there's loads going on in there to help you write a story. Or A really interesting choice here as well. Describe life as you imagine it in 200 years' time. So this is one of those rare occasions where the creative writing section is almost crossing over into paper two. Into kind of non-fiction writing. So you could go the really, really creative, imaginative route on this, or it could be more like a kind of a piece of argumentative writing, I guess. Now, I've kind of given away some of my thoughts straight away there. What I want you to do is to pause this maybe just for 60 seconds and decide which one would you choose, which option would you choose, and can you write for me a sentence or two to explain why? And we'll compare your thoughts to my thoughts in a sec. This is a weird one. Quite often you can mash the two together. But I'm kind of looking at the story and looking at described life in 200 years and thinking this is one of those occasions where you probably can't mash the two tasks together. So if that's something you've relied on in the past, that might be worth thinking about just here. Let's pause 1 minute. Okay, so this is what I put down. I looked at the picture, and you'll probably have noticed from what I was saying before, I'm quite keen on this picture. I think that I could be really, really imaginative with both the picture and a story about time travel. I've already got loads of ideas. Time travel is something that I'm quite interested in anyway. I've gone off Doctor Who lately, but I have liked it in the past. I love the Back to the Future movies, Hot Tub Time Machine, things like that. I really, really like. And I like a lot of science fiction, so I've got stacks of ideas in my head already. And the picture really helps me because I'm thinking it's going to be inspired by the picture, how they're going to actually travel. So I can see in the picture like all these ticket booths just here. And then it's almost like they kind of buy something in the ticket booth and then step out into the light and kind of get sucked off into some kind of future, something like that, like kind of drawn into the light. So that's really sparked my imagination. Because it's a story, I know that I can use good old-fashioned story mountain that I learned all about in year 2 and then found out in year 10. It's actually called Freytag's triangle. So I can use my good old-fashioned story structure on that one. I'm thinking I could possibly use the first person, which is something that I like doing. I like writing in the first person and focus on one main character. If I use first person, that would be me. It's either me myself or me in a persona as someone else. So I've got loads of ideas for the picture. But I did give some really good thought to this one as well, because actually, as I'm sure some of you will know from school, I prefer writing non-fiction. But when I thought about this one, I thought, yeah, I can use a non-fiction style. That's cool. I can use lots of description, but then I thought maybe it would be more technical vocabulary if I'm talking about the future, and I'm not quite so confident on that. And then I thought to myself, perhaps in 200 years, things will be really similar to how they are nowadays. But are they going to be worse because of the environment or better because of technology? And I don't really know at the moment. So my mind is kind of not quite so determined on this one. I'm like, yeah, it still could be creative, but I could make it more persuasive. And I do like a bit of persuasive writing, so that could work. And then I started thinking this could be really difficult to structure actually, because maybe I can think about 5 things that could be different in the future, but it's not like I'm going to get that really lovely structure. It's almost like 5 subheadings, and I'm not feeling that that's a really clever structure that would help me get the marks that I want to mark. And yeah, I'd be really worried that it would just kind of fizzle out instead of coming to a really strong ending. So you can definitely see from my thoughts on the 2 questions that I would definitely go for the story on this one. I've got loads of ideas with the story, and I think that I can bring it to a satisfying conclusion. This one, yeah, I probably could have a good go at it, but I wouldn't know where to start, where to finish, and stop it being a bit clunky in way of structure. So the next thing I want to think about is this technique for planning. So I don't know if any of you have used this technique for planning before, where you take the picture and you divide it into 4, and then you look really closely at each quadrant. and see what you can describe, really, see what you can see and what you can describe in each quadrant. That's going to make your story or your description really effective. So what I want you to think about is this a good technique for writing a story about time travel, or is it not such a good technique? And see if you can come up with the pros and the cons. So have a think about that just for a few seconds. And pause if you want. Okay, so I think that this is quite a good technique to use. Having said that, I don't think it's a technique that you should rely on, because sometimes you don't get a nice busy picture like this. On one paper, there was just a picture of a gnarly old man kind of staring straight at the camera. And if you tried to divide him into four, it would have been a very, very boring description. It wouldn't have worked at all. And in fact, when I was marking that paper, I read so many stories or descriptions of all the blackheads on his nose, and that wasn't very entertaining for me, I can absolutely assure you. And that's because people have kind of been a little brainwashed into looking quickly and using this technique. Okay, so it is a good technique if you have a nice busy picture. If you have an unbusy picture, it's not such a good technique. It's a really good technique if it's like just write a description of time travel as suggested by this picture. So if it was a description of rather than a story about, again, it could be really, really good to use this technique. For this particular one, why I think it is a good technique is because in our Freytag's triangle, we've got our establishment phase as part of the rising action. In our establishment phase of the story, we want to establish setting and character. And this picture will really, really help settle us into our writing, because we can zoom in really closely and describe what the setting is like, the station that's going to transport us into the future or into the past. It's just time travel. Okay, so in the establishment phase, establishing the setting, really, really handy. And similarly, in the establishment, you have to establish the character. So you can kind of look at all these characters. They are a bit bleak and faceless, aren't they? But you could imagine that you're this person here standing right in front of the ticket booth, for example. Okay, so maybe you could choose one of the characters in the picture, and that gives you a really good place to start your narrative. So what I'm saying, dividing your picture into four, is it a good technique? Yeah, it's a great technique if you've got a nice busy picture. Don't rely on this technique solely, though, in case you get a very, very simple picture with not much going on in it, as has happened many times before. Don't rely on it if you're writing a story, because you wouldn't want to set your whole story there. It would be a boring story. Okay, but it definitely has a place, and it should just be one of the techniques that you use for doing your planning. So let's move on to the vocabulary that I mentioned when I was going through the learning question at the beginning. And I want you to think about the middle of the mark scheme again, because when you get your grades, they are kind of on a standard curve, and that means that almost all of the marks that you're going to get will be mashed towards the middle of the standard curve. That's just the way that it works. What are these guys doing here? Don't know. So kind of upper level 2, that's your grade 3, and your low 4 grade GCSE. Lower level 3, which if you get into the middle of it, that's like a solid good pass, like a 5. Bottom of it would be a 4, top of it would be a 6. And upper level 3, which is kind of like 6, 7 borderline and above, you probably, by getting everything at the top of upper level 3, you'd probably be looking at an 8 anyway. And the words that we use, so for upper level 2, they describe the vocabulary used as conscious. So if you remember from my previous video when I talked about this, conscious vocabulary means you go into that exam and your teacher has told you that you've got to use vocabulary for effect, don't just think of the first word that comes into your head. Try and use effective vocabulary. So you are choosing vocabulary, but unfortunately, sometimes the vocabulary that you choose isn't really effective. It's not working in that situation for one reason or another. You are clearly trying to use good vocabulary, but you're just not pulling that off. Lower level 3, clear vocabulary. So you're choosing your vocabulary and it helps you write your story or write your description clearly. Yeah, you might make one or two little slip ups. Sometimes you might be ambitious and it doesn't quite work, but overall, most of it is clear. Sometimes it might not be particularly ambitious, but it's kind of safe and it's right. Upper level 3 is about clear vocabulary for effect, and it's beginning to become more sophisticated vocabulary at this point. So that is going to be vocabulary that starts to sound like something you might read in an adult novel, for example, and it doesn't have to be really fancy vocabulary, but it's just a really well chosen. It's showing that you do have a wide vocabulary. So what I want you to do is to pause now and write down 3 subheadings: upper level 2, lower level 3, and upper level 3. I want you to go around the quadrants where I have described, I should say the people down there, I don't know where it's gone, the windows, the people, the light and the light, different types of light going on there. And can you group this vocabulary under each subheading? So if you think it's upper level 2, drag it over under this subheading. If you think it's lower level 3, nice and clear, bit unambitious, but nice and clear here. And if you think it's a kind of becoming sophisticated, the vocabulary, pop it down here. So pause, take 2 or 3 minutes to have a go at that, and then I'll go through it together and explain why I've put the vocabulary where I've put it. And while you're doing that, I'm going to type in the people. Okay, give yourself about 2 more minutes. I'm not going to just sit here in silence for 2 minutes, so please pause me. Okay, so let's have a look and see if we can find some of this upper level 2 vocabulary then. So straight away, the one that jumps out to me, because it's sitting right there, is ginormous. And ginormous is a really babyish word. It's not even a real word. It's just horrible. What you're probably thinking of when you write ginormous is this word gigantic. And I'd be putting gigantic down as clear. It's not really advanced, it's not really sophisticated, but probably when you're thinking of ginormous, what you really mean is gigantic. Still working in this quadrant, I would be putting humongous over here because it's just, again, like humongous is a real word, which is different from ginormous, but it is a kind of thing that you read in like 8-year-old fiction. Actually, don't even read it in 8-year-old fiction anymore. It's just like a really clumsy word. It's quite a childish word. However, a really good word to describe the window is immense. And I'd put that in vocabulary for effect there, because it also kind of indicates a quite weighty windows as well as being large. And then arcing, like that arched shape there, that could be in either of these really, depending on how you use it. So I'll just hang that there for now. Right, let's have a look down in the description of the people. And again, hopefully you spotted that creepy is a real upper level 2 word. Creepy is, again, quite babyish. quite a childish word. Probably even when you were in Key Stage 2, your teachers were saying, no, try and think of something better than that. So if you're ever tempted to put creepy, let's just shift it up a gear and go for sinister, or, well, I was going to say menacing, but menacing is really good, actually. Scary. I think you could get away with a scary in lower level 3, but really, again, scary is quite childish word. And something like menacing would be much better. So people here have a menacing presence. And in fact, I was going to put menacing there, lower level 3, but I think menacing is a really good upper level 3 kind of word. All the people do look old-fashioned. It's not kind of babyish and simplistic. It just does what it says. It's just clear and simple, and it makes the point. However, a really fancy way of saying old-fashioned is archaic. So you can see they're dressed in archaic fashions, and that's a much more sophisticated way of saying old-fashioned. And then these are two great words, and these could kind of fall on either side depending on what anything else is like. The people do seem to be huddled in groups, and the atmosphere and the mood they're creating is quite shadowy. So again, this would go down here, I think. Now, I can't see much left that would be an upper level 2 kind of word, possibly beaming. Okay, so if you have a look at this light here, a typical upper level 2 person would say something like, the light came beaming in through the window. It's not horrible, but if beaming was the kind of vocabulary which was going with all of this, if this had all been used somewhere else in the story, then beaming would kind of maintain that very conscious vocabulary, upper level 2 kind of mood and tone. Beaming could be lower level 3 if it was just kind of like used not too much. If we have a look at the rest of these words, illuminating, that's a lovely word. It's quite a sciencey word, so don't be afraid to use some of your other subjects to help you. And the penetrating light, so rather than the light beaming down, the penetrating light kind of glaring down, that would be really good. So penetrating, as if the light can almost cut through you, where it's going to do something weird to you if it's going to take you away to a different time. Brilliant for light means the brightness of the light. So in this term, that could be a really effective bit of vocabulary, becoming sophisticated. If it was brilliant light because it was making everything really bright, then it would go there. But brilliant as in really, really light and bright. And kind of the easier version of brilliant would be bright, and that would be nice, clear vocabulary. The glare of, that could sit really nicely in there because light does seem to be glaring down. And if you think glare is what human does, you could develop some personification with that one. So developing the personification could move it over here. A puddle of light, that's really lovely metaphor there. Again, I'll probably put this somewhere in between these two. Maybe we just edge it into upper level 3 there. It's really lovely. But these last two, ethereal, that means ghostly, like out of the ether. It's a beautiful word. You might have used that when you study in Macbeth, for example, like the ethereal mood created by the ghosts, as if you're kind of coming out of the ether, like the mist from heaven or hell. And translucent, which again, that's a physics word, science word, isn't it? So you can kind of half see through it, half not, translucent. And that would be a really good sophisticated vocabulary. So can you see how it builds up here? And actually, you don't have to think too hard. You don't have to sound as if you have swallowed the thesaurus to get into upper level 3. You just need to be using vocabulary that you know, and you're using it really effectively. If you're not sure, stick to your clear, safe vocabulary. If your target grade is a 4, 5, or a 6, try and be just really clear. Just choose the best word for the purpose. It's better to do that than try and be fancy and make a horrible slip up like this. So that's your vocabulary, and one of your success criteria for the task is going to be focused on vocabulary. Now the next one is, I guess I'd probably call one of my pet peeves as a teacher and as an examiner, and it's what I call the curse of the ing sentence. Sometime, probably in year 6, definitely in year 7, you're told to use a variety of sentence starters. And sometimes these can be called fronted adverbial. Sometimes I'm using fronted adverbial. Sometimes it's just a phrase, just a plain old phrase. It's not fronting an adverbial at all. So they are quite problematic, these ings. I'll show you a couple of correct ones. Staring into the light, he wondered which century he would end up in. And that should be over there. That should be over there. Let's get that in the right place. So we've got our ing just here. And we've got he wondered, which finishes off the meaning of the sentence just here. Here we've got our ing, wondering what century he would end up in. So it's the same sentence, I've just twisted it round. He stared into the light. Now, what we call these INGs, they're called verbs in the continuous or progressive aspect. And when you just have them hanging on their own like that, the action just keeps going on. And because we're humans and because we want to get our grammar right, we need something to finish that off. Both of those are called fronted adverbials because they're describing what's going on with the verb. He wondered. How did he wonder? Or what was he doing when he was wondering? Well, he was staring into the light. Here, he stared into the light. What was he doing while he stared into the light? He was thinking, he was wondering what century he would end up in. Okay, but these ed verbs, we've got this past participle here, is a finished verb in the simple past tense. And the main clause makes sense on its own and also makes sense of the ing clause. So we could take away both of those ing clauses and it still makes sense. He wondered which century he'd end up in. It's a sentence. He stared into the light. That's a sentence, very short one. All these are doing is giving us more detail to go with these verbs here. You need to finish your sentences off with what's called a finite clause, and that's your finite clause there and that main clause. That's not the only way you can do it, though. You can also use still the past continuous tense. You can use a continuous tense as opposed to the continuous aspect. So staring into the light, he was wondering which century he would end up in. So here we've got the modal verb, putting that into the past continuous tense. So it's taking that wondering verb and making it finished. He was wondering. He was back then, he's not anymore. Wondering what century he would end up in. He was staring into the light. So again, the past continuous tense. So 2 ways you can finish off your sentences and create a finite, a finished clause with the EDs, or using the modal auxiliary. Here it's was, it could be is in the present tense. Okay, so all of these ones make sense on their own, and these ing clauses are adding detail onto how was he staring, how was he wondering. Okay. Now, what I'd like you to have a go at for me before we move on is seeing if you can make these sentences right. So none of them are right. They're grammatically incorrect. None of these sentences are finished. You need to make them finished. You need to turn one of the clauses into a finite clause. How are you going to do it? Okay, so first one says penetrating light glaring through the high windows. It's not finished. How are you going to make that finished? Wandering around, shadowy figures moving aimlessly. It's not finished. How are you going to make it finished? Where's your main clause going to go? Dominating the station, immense windows, judging the milling passengers. Again, which verb do you need to change to put that into the past tense to finish it off nicely? Puddling on the ground, powerful light strobing through the window. Same thing. And then finally, nervously approaching the dominating ticket booths. Number 5 is a little bit different. You might have to add and change a bit more for number 5. What are you going to have to change or add to make number 5 make sense? I'll show you some answers at the end. Pause the video and have a little go at that task. Okay, so I'm going to set you off to do some writing in a minute, but I want you to understand what's in it for you, what we've been learning about today. So we've been talking about incorrect grammar and poor vocab choices. That's what we're aiming to avoid. Why? What's the point? Some of those sentences back there, those wrong sentences, they sound all right, they sound quite good. What's the problem? This is a problem. Your exam's going to be marked by English teachers. Okay, I work with a big team of senior examiners, and I know that there are hundreds of like normal assistant examiners who work marking your exams as well. Hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of English teachers, probably thousands of English teachers who want to earn some extra money during the summer, and they're going to be marking your work. So that's the first thing. And English teachers are fussy about vocabulary and grammar. So that's who your real audience is, not the local paper, it's someone else's teacher. Okay, so that's the first reason why it's really, really important to get your grammar and your vocabulary right. The second reason why it's really, really important is this. When we mark your creative writing and your argumentative writing on paper 2, we mark it a little bit different from your reading. When we mark your reading, what we do is start at the bottom of the mark scheme, and as we're reading along, we kind of move up the mark scheme a little bit like a ladder. So as you do more good things, we move further and further up the ladder. When we're marking your creative writing, what we tend to do is give it a quick skim read through first before we start banging marks onto your work. That's what I definitely do anyway. And then when I get to the end, having skim read your work, the first thing I ask myself is, was it clear? And that's lower level 3. So this, for your creative writing, this is where I start. And this is how we're trained to mark your work as well. We ask ourselves, is it clear? And I've had a quick read through it, and I think to myself, well, yeah, it was clear. So I start looking up the mark scheme to see how far up the mark scheme I can go with your work when I read it through again much more carefully. Okay, so that's what I would do, moving up the mark scheme there. Is it clear? Yes, it is. How far can I go up? If I answer that question after having quickly read through your work, is it clear? No. Well, I've only got one way to go, one direction to go, and that's looking down the mark scheme. If I'm not sure if it's clear, I'm going to be searching for that clarity when I read through it closely, because we want to give you the mark that is justified. We want to give you the right mark for your work. So I'm going to read it again and try and make sure it definitely is not clear before I start marking you down here and dragging these comments onto your work. And I've been talking about vocabulary and grammar, and you get marked for AO5, which is your content and your organisation, and you also get marked for AO6, which is your spelling, punctuation and grammar. And the reason why sentences, first of all, are really, really important is because using sentences accurately helps me decide whether your work's clear or not. Okay, so if we have a look here, I've marked all the grammar stuff in green over here. So over here it says, is it consistently clear? for upper level 3? Is it just clear for lower level 3? That's where I start. Is it mostly successful? It's not quite clear, but almost. Is it some success? So it's not really clear at all, but bits of it are clear. Okay, so do you see what I mean over here? And then over here, if you have a look, full range of sentence forms with secure control of grammatical structures. So anyone who's up there, good for you, you're going to get a really good mark. A variety of sentence forms, so you need to use those things, but can you control them? Mostly control grammatical structures. You're going to get marks over here if you can control them, but if you can't control them, it's not going to be clear, is it? Okay, and then you can have a look down the mark scheme and see what happens. Attempt the sentences, so you're trying to use the ings. Some control, sometimes you get it right, sometimes you don't get it right. And if sometimes you don't get it right, it's not going to be clear. Okay, and then right at the bottom, down in level 1 here, so that's obviously going to be a GCSE fail. Limited control of agreement. You just can't get those ings right. You can't get your verbs right. And that's really sad because you're trying to use good sentence forms, but you just can't quite manage it. Now let's have a look at the vocabulary, and you'll see the vocab comes up even more on both sides. Vocab is a third bullet point. So back down to clear again, lower level 3, vocabulary clearly chosen for effect. Just here. And then we've looked at these already. Sophisticated vocabulary, increasingly sophisticated. So it's beginning to get sophisticated for your upper level 3. But level 2, upper level 2, conscious use of vocabulary. So it's when you know you've got to use good vocabulary, but you're not sure quite how to. And then lower level 2, attempts or begins to vary vocabulary down here. Okay. So sometimes actually upper level 2 can be a bit of a disaster when you're consciously choosing some really, really bad vocabulary, things like ginormous. Okay, and then over here in our SPAG, our spelling, punctuation and grammar, we see vocab again. The best vocab is extensive and ambitious. It says it not once, but twice. Ambitious vocab has to be spelled properly for that one. Standard English. So again, ginormous. It's not standard English, it's a fake word. Level 3 is what most of you should be going for. Standard English, accurate spelling of complex irregular words. Increasingly sophisticated use of vocabulary. So you see it's the same on both sides of the mark scheme. So you could end up getting 9 marks over here, plus, what is it, upper level 3, kind of up to 18 marks over here. It's on both sides. So if you mess it up on one side, you're losing marks on both sides. Okay. Level 2, top of level 2, still grab your pass. Some use of standard English, some accurate spelling, and a varied use of vocabulary. You see how it's working here. So that's what's in it for you. If you're getting your grammar nice and accurate and correct, your writing will be clear and you will pass your GCSE English. If you get your grammar wrong, it probably won't be clear, and then you're looking down the mark scheme instead of up. And then vocabulary. If you're beginning to get a little bit more sophisticated with your vocab, if you're choosing the right word, even if it's not an amazing word, but it's just the right word, then you're level 3 on this side, and level 3 on this side. And that's going to get you your 5s and your 6s, and even higher if you can get into that level 3 band. Okay, so make sure that you're getting your vocab right. Okay, here is your task then. Have a go at writing an answer to this question. Here's your success criteria. Use clear and effective vocabulary. No babyish words on one hand, but on the other hand, don't try and sound like you've swallowed the thesaurus, because that just sounds awkward. And that's almost as bad as using the babyish words. Use a couple of sentences that start with the ing, but make sure there is a main clause to finish off that ing clause so that it's grammatically correct. You've got 40 minutes for this creative writing, and you should aim for 300 to 500 words. Some of you will be able to bang out 300 words in no time at all. If you manage to do 300 words in 25 minutes, say, spend a bit of time checking your work and making sure of things like the ing sentences. And then finally, that we talked about right at the beginning, use the image to help you establish the setting and the characters if you're going for the story. one, which I would recommend in this case, actually. So that is your task. And if I'm your teacher, then please do submit it to me and I will mark it, and that'll be really useful for your portfolio for your teacher assessed work. So please do submit that to me. But before we go, let's quickly go over these sentences, these ing sentences. So here's the first incorrect one. And this is how you make it right. You change glaring to glared, or change it to was glaring. So penetrating light was glaring through the high windows, or penetrating light glared through the high windows. It's finished, it's got an ed. Wandering around, shadowy figures moved aimlessly. Okay, so we've got an ed there instead of a y, instead of a ing, sorry. If you're desperate to stick with the ing, it's wandering around, shadowy figures were moving aimlessly, and that makes that grammatically correct just by putting the were in there. So judging needs to change to judge. Dominating the station, immense windows judged the milling passengers. If you want to add rather than crossing out, dominating the station, immense windows were judging the milling passengers. So you're adding in that auxiliary were to make it a finite finished main clause. Puddling on the ground, powerful lights were strobing. I prefer that one, that's why I put it first. Powerful lights were strobing through the window. So you've got the were added there to the ing to make that finish. You can go for strobed. I don't think it sounds quite right somehow. It is grammatically correct, it just doesn't sound so good. Puddling on the ground, powerful lights strobed through the window. Okay, and then finally you had to add a clause. Okay, so nervously approaching the ticket booth dominated, what did they dominate? His mind, or it could be they dominated the station, whatever you like. And then nervously approaching the dominating ticket booths, he panicked. Okay, so just a really, really short, finite main clause there. Really, really good luck with your creative writing. As I said, submit it and I'll mark it and I'll give you some feedback. I'll see you next time when we're going to be doing some work on paper 2. Bye.